So historically, China has actually been quite bad at this because of a phenomenon that we call the internalization of external propaganda. Often China is governed in a way that we call campaign-style governance. So the top leadership will express their aspirations, what they want, and then down the echelons, down different levels of government, they then have to interpret this and produce results. And those results are usually upward facing instead of outward. So they're produced for their superiors, and they're not particularly good at evaluating how influential their campaigns have been, or they look at the wrong metrics. They look at how many people have seen it, how many people have read this insert in a newspaper, or seen or retweeted or liked this social media post, instead of really critically thinking about who this has reached, has it changed their minds, has it really helped? So this has been a problem in Chinese propaganda for a long time. It feels like they're just literally translating the internal propaganda for an external foreign audience. But they are getting much better at this now, particularly since Xi Jinping launched his initiative in the very early months of his leadership, calling for Chinese propaganda to tell the China story well. He called for state media, in his words, to be a surnamed party, and to claw back space that had been lost to commercial press and social media over the years, and to fill that space up with the government's narrative, with state media. So since then, we've seen a phenomenon of sort of a devolution of propaganda production. Within the past year, for example, these things called international communication centers have been opening all across the country by provincial level governments, or even sub-provincial, municipal or lower. And then they're creating new brands, new studios that can do a couple of things. First, they can sort of cloak the state media origins. So, consumers of this news won't necessarily know that this is government propaganda. And secondly, they can tailor these messages for different audiences. A few notable examples are in Yunnan province in the southwest of China, near Southeast Asia. They have a provincial level ICC that produces messages that are tailored for a Southeast Asian audience, and using issues that are relevant to people there. In Shenzhen, across from Hong Kong, we see the same thing happening with their ICC producing propaganda for a Cantonese-speaking audience, and people in Hong Kong in the region to push the Greater Bay region, this new mega metropolis they're trying to create that will more effectively absorb Hong Kong and Macau into mainland China. And in Fujian province across the Taiwan Strait, are doing the same for Taiwanese audience, producing propaganda that uses more relevant cultural touchstones and language. So this has been an area where China's not done fantastic in the past, but I think they're really making an effort at this point to do better, and it's something we should be monitoring closely. I think obviously it can be very context dependent. Sometimes certain campaigns are very focused on short-term goals and very regional or locally focused ones. For example, they've been really pushing this narrative about the Fukushima wastewater in Japan and how destructive this is and how irresponsible Japan is. And that's, very short-term focused, very regional. But if I were to identify one overarching goal that I think really applies almost across the board, is that China is very invested in creating a positive image of itself. And it sees, this is sort of its goal in domestic and international propaganda, and it sees both as instrumental for regime legitimacy. And this is, I think it is very important for them to be seen as a responsible world power and a force for good for the world. And myself personally, I'm not an expert in Russian propaganda at all, but the impression that I get from others is that Russia is very determined to discredit the West and to tear down the institutions and values that matter to the Western world, and it is more sort of destructively focused, and it's more determined to produce chaos. And I think to a certain extent that aligns with China as well, because China also wants to discredit what is universal values, which they see as purely Western values. But at the same time, China is much more concerned about being seen as a responsible world power and as a model to emulate, that in a way perhaps Russia is not. For example, a point that keeps coming up again and again in Chinese propaganda, particularly under Xi Jinping in the past few years, is this idea of China as a civilizational state. And one of Xi Jinping's initiatives, the Chinese motive of modernization, they have been branding this as a new form of human civilization that represents the future direction for all human civilization. So basically, China wants to attack the idea of, the West being the only model to emulate, and it wants to discredit that model and tear it down. But it wants to take its place in a way. It wants to produce a world that is at best bipolar, that there are not an infinite range of possibilities, but just the Western model and the model represented by China. And it wants to create an informational environment in which this is sort of a type of governance that others should be emulating. And so I think it's very, for its legitimacy at home and abroad, it's very concerned with being seen as the official slogan in China is lovable, respectable, and credible. This is how it wants to be seen around the world. So I think that's how it sort of differentiates itself in a way from other countries like Russia's that don't necessarily want to put themselves forward as a model for others to emulate and to admire.